Before we get into the topics, as outlined in the flow and sequence, I want to draw your attention to something important. Keep this in mind as we progress through this series. A very brief overlook at the revenue structure and behavior. The slide here depicts the revenue structure for a typical tertiary care hospital. The numbers are indicative and could change widely between regions and locations, and also depending on the nature of hospital services. This has an emerging market slant. The purpose is only to give you a glimpse into how various service lines contribute to the overall revenues of a typical private fee-for-service tertiary healthcare hospital. And more importantly, I want to remind doctors that there is really no hospital or healthcare business without them. So typically, diagnostics, imaging, pathology, etc. occupy about 22% of the overall revenue. The inpatient beds occupy approximately 14% of the overall revenue. Intensive care units, operating room procedures, another 24%. Emergency rooms and OPDs, approximately 6%. Pharma and pharmacy drug sales, approximately 31%. And then, of course, canteen, parking, miscellaneous, between 3 and 5%. Now, as is evident, the top three sources of revenue occupy almost 75% of all the revenues. Just look at it. Look at pharma, 31%. Look at OR and ICU, 24%. And then look at diagnostics, 22%. Now that's 75% of all revenues, and the profit margins from these revenue sources are also relatively higher. Remember that every dollar of revenue that accrue to the hospital is due to the doctors. They decide when to admit. They decide what diagnostics to order. They determine what medicines to prescribe, when to transfer, when to discharge, and when to follow up a patient. Even the innocuous canteen and parking revenues, 3% or so, is also due to the doctors, yeah? Why would I visit a hospital and pay parking fees and eat at the cafeteria if not for meeting or consulting a doctor? Doctors should remember this undeniable fact. We will revisit this in detail later in the series, but for now, we get back into taking a peek into the minds of our doctors. Okay, we looked at the revenue structure of a typical tertiary care hospital. We will now look at the cost components that are the source and support for the revenue lines which we just saw in the earlier exhibit. Right? As you can see from this block of cost structure line items and those structure line items as a percentage of overall revenue, you will see that the professional costs, that is the costs of doctors' salaries and their benefits, typically account for about 22 to 24% of overall revenue. All other payroll costs, which includes the cost of nurses, the cost of administrative staff, all of that is about 18 to 22%. The total payroll costs, these two line items put together, for a reasonably well-run hospital would probably be around 45 to 55% of overall revenue of the hospital. Anything more than that is tricky. Cost of materials and drugs add another 18 to 20%. Administrative costs, operative costs, marketing costs, and others account for the rest. So if you see, doctors who actually drive, as I mentioned in the previous exhibit, who drive 100% of the revenues, occupy only about 20 to 24% of the costs associated with the overall revenue. In a typical services industry, these professional costs would be much higher. But we know that hospitals are Janus-faced. It looks like services but behaves like a production enterprise financially. Having said that, though, in my opinion, there is money that is left on the table that I think doctors could take home with better negotiation and a better understanding of hospital economics. Another not so obvious inference from this exhibit is that the bulk of the total costs seem variable, right? You might think professional costs, you might think staff costs, you might think material and pharma costs, should be variable. But you and I, we both know that theoretically the staff costs cannot be adjusted to demand. We all know that this is not possible in hospitals. So in practice, it is generally only material costs and pharmacy costs, about 30%, that might truly qualify as variable. And even here, there are certain limitations. So what appears as variable actually behaves like fixed or semi-fixed in the short to medium term. This makes hospitals a fixed cost beast, and administrators must deal with what I refer to as the persistent fixed cost dilemma. The economics of a hospital that delivers health services behaves strangely like a manufacturing industry. The added debt that most hospitals take on in what could be a poorly designed capital structure adds to the drama that unfolds during a typical day at a hospital. We will look at capital structure a bit later. For now, let us get into how capital costs get applied when starting a new hospital. So with that, we've covered the typical revenue and cost structure and their behavior for a typical tertiary care hospital.